The night it happened, I was sitting alone in the dim living room, a half-empty glass of cheap whiskey on the table, the flicker of the hollow screen painting shadows across the walls. For weeks the broadcast had been the same. Alien propaganda flooding every frequency, every channel, every device. At first, people treated it like a novelty. We were used to wars, disasters, corruption. So what was? Another voice in the void, pretending it owned the stars. But that night it was different. The screen shifted without warning, the familiar static ripple cutting across the broadcast, and suddenly the alien faces filled the room. They weren't the sleek, golden figures from the first days. No, these were predators, scaled, sharp-toothed, with cold, glinting eyes that seemed to laugh. Even when silent, they didn't speak our language with words they didn't need to. The translation device did the work, spitting their mockery in flawless human tongue. Humanity, the voice boomed, dripping with arrogance. You are weak, and weakness exists to be broken. At first, I thought it was just more of their chest thumping, but then the image cut to something else, something I will never erase from my mind. Children, human children, naked, terrified, locked in cages. The camera zoomed close as one of the scaled creatures dragged a boy, no older than 10, out into the light. The boy screamed for his mother. His voice was raw, broken, desperate. The alien's claws curled around the child's neck. And then the monster grinned. The audience, because yes, there was an audience, you could hear them, erupted in laughter, alien laughter. High-pitched, rattling, cruel. They were watching us suffer as entertainment. And then it happened. The clawed hand snapped forward and the boy fell limp. The screen froze on his lifeless face for 3 unbearable seconds. Then the feed continued, cycling through cage after cage. The bottle of whiskey slipped from my hand, shattered against the floor. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, and I wasn't alone. The streets outside began to roar with voices, shouts, the sound of glass breaking, alarms wailing. In apartment blocks, in bars, in city squares, every human eye was glued to the same nightmare. And something inside us snapped. That broadcast was never meant for us. Later, we learned it was a live stream, a sport for them, their way of mocking the inferior species they thought would never rise. But the bastards made one mistake. They didn't block human access. They let us watch. They wanted us to watch. I sat, their fists clenched, my whole body trembling with rage. My brother had fought in the Mars campaigns, bled to protect a colony that wasn't even his home, and now I imagined him in those cages. I imagined my father who died building ships that were supposed to secure our place in space, only to see us humiliated like animals. And I knew every man watching that night knew that there would be no forgiveness. All across the world, riots exploded into the streets, not against each other. This time not for politics, not for borders. Humanity had been given a common enemy, and for the first time in history it was clear, undeniable, and personal. We were no longer victims. We were the storm waiting to be unleashed. And as the broadcast looped, repeating the torment again and again, I whispered into the empty room, the taste of whiskey still burning my throat. They think we're weak. They'll learn what rage is. The days that followed the broadcast were unlike anything I had ever lived through. The world had always been divided by nations, flags, borders, money and lies. But the broadcast ripped all of that apart. When people saw their children strangled, for sport when they heard alien, laughter echoing through their homes, when they realized that every proud achievement of mankind meant nothing to the ones who held power over the stars, something ancient broke free inside us. Rage. I lived in what used to be called New Chicago, a city that had grown fat and crowded around the veins of trade, roots between Earth and Mars. Skyscrapers touched the clouds, neon signs painted the night, and the streets were always thick with noise. But after the broadcast, the noise changed. No one cared about the endless traffic or the usual fights between street gangs. Now you could hear one word echoing in every alley, whispered like a prayer, shouted like a curse: revenge. The first riots weren't even riots. They were uprisings, men who had wasted their lives drowning in cheap drink and forgotten jobs suddenly marched in the streets with weapons, dragging old rifles, homemade bombs, anything that could kill. They burned alien embassies. They stormed corporate offices that had once traded contracts with the invaders. For the first time in my life, I saw ordinary men willing to die for something bigger than their own survival. I didn't stand aside. My brother had been gone for 5 years, his body buried somewhere in the dust of Mars after a training accident that was nothing more than political cover. My father had died building ships for a government that abandoned him when the machines replaced his hands. And now I had watched children murdered live on a screen while alien beasts laughed at us like circus animals. Enough was enough. I remember the first night I joined them. The streets of New Chicago were filled with firelight, smoke rising against the glass towers like war banners. A group of men stood in front of an old warehouse, faces hidden by scarves, weapons clutched tight. I recognized one of them, an old friend from the docks named Harris, a man who had spent half his life breaking his backloading star freighters for pennies. He saw me, nodded once, and handed me a rusted shotgun. "About time you showed up," he said. His voice was flat, not mocking, just hard. "You saw it too." I nodded. "I saw everything." "Then you're one of us now." The warehouse was no ordinary building. Inside they had stockpiled weapons, guns stolen from corporate guards, explosives built from mining equipment, even a few prototype rail guns smuggled off the black market. Men and women sat at tables carving out crude armbands marked with the symbol of a clenched fist. The smell of sweat, oil, and determination filled the air. It wasn't an army, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. Harris led me deeper inside, where an old hollow screen flickered with static. A recording of the broadcast played. Again, the same nightmare loop of children strangled, cages rattled, alien laughter cutting like knives. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing, turned toward the screen, and fell silent. The rage was a living thing. You could feel it in your chest, in your bones. It wasn't the wild chaos of drunks throwing bottles in the street. It was sharper, colder, focused. The kind of rage that builds revolutions. That night we made a vow. No one spoke it out loud, but we didn't need to. Every clenched fist, every tightened jaw, every tear running down a hardened face said the same thing. We would not forgive, we would not forget, and we would not stop until the stars themselves burned with our vengeance. The next days blurred into a rhythm of violence and planning, Governments tried to calm the riots at first. They sent out drones to scatter protesters, soldiers to push us back, politicians to speak about diplomacy and cooperation. But none of it mattered. Those speeches died the moment people remembered the images of their children. You can't negotiate with rage. You can't calm a storm with words when blood has already been spilled. And so humanity turned its back on its so-called leaders. In the streets we formed our own networks. The docks became staging grounds, abandoned. Factories turned into armories. Old satellites were hacked and repurposed to send encrypted messages across the globe. Men who had once been enemies now shook hands and made plans. Gangs that had spilled each other's blood on corners for decades now shared weapons and information. It didn't matter where you came from or what you had once believed. All that mattered was that you were human and you were angry. I remember one meeting in particular. About 2 weeks after the broadcast, we gathered in the ruins of an old church. Its stained glass windows, shattered pews overturned, candles burned along the walls, casting shadows across faces hard as stone. Harris stood at the front beside a scarred veteran named Dorn who had once commanded a Martian regiment before he was thrown aside by politicians. Dorn's voice was gravel, deep and broken from years of shouting orders in the dust storms of Mars. They think we're animals, he said, pacing slowly across the broken altar. They think we're too divided, too weak, too stupid to rise. They killed our children and laughed. They broadcast our humiliation to the galaxy, and now every alien out there believes the same lie, that humanity is finished. He stopped, turned, and his eyes burned in the candle light. But I say this, we are not finished. We are only beginning. The men roared in agreement, fists pounding the pews, weapons raised. I felt my throat tighten, my chest burning with something I hadn't felt in years. Hope twisted with rage. Dorn lifted his hand, and the room fell silent again. An enemy like this cannot be fought with words. It cannot be fought with half measures. We will not beg for peace, and we will not wait for mercy. We will strike first. We will strike hard, and when we rise, the galaxy will never forget the day humanity stopped being prey. Those words seared into me like fire. For the first time in my life, I believed in something greater than myself, not a government, not a flag, but in the raw fury of men who refused to bow. From that night on, I trained like a man possessed. We practiced with rifles until our shoulders were bruised. We drilled with knives until our hands bled. We learned to build explosives from scraps, to move silently through ruins, to strike like shadows and vanish before the drones could catch us. Every man was a soldier now, whether he had ever worn a uniform or not. The world burned, but we didn't care. Skirmishes broke out daily between resistance fighters and government forces trying to maintain control. Corporations panicked as their facilities were seized. Alien diplomats fled the planet in fear, their ships leaving trails of fire in the night sky. And then, for the first time since they broadcast, the aliens themselves returned. It wasn't a fleet, just a single ship, massive and silver, descending into orbit like a predator circling its prey. They thought we would cower, that we would beg, that we would come crawling for forgiveness. But they didn't understand what they had unleashed when their message came through the skies, booming across every city. There Words were simple: submit or be erased. The world froze. For a moment silence held us, then in New Chicago, in the streets below my window, a man shouted back, not through any speaker, not with any broadcast, but with his own voice, "Erase us then, you bastards, see what happens." The crowd erupted, the shout became a chorus then. A roar, a thunder that shook the towers. And as I looked out over the sea of faces, fists raised, weapons lifted, I realized something terrifying and beautiful. We weren't afraid anymore. We were ready. That night I dreamed of fire. Cities burning, ships falling, alien screams torn apart by human rage. I woke, with sweat soaking my skin, my hands clenched into fists, and I knew the dream wasn't just fantasy, it was prophecy, because humanity had been humiliated for the last time, and now war was coming. The first strike wasn't meant to succeed, we knew that. Dorn said it 100 times, his gravel voice cutting through the smoke-filled warehouse where we gathered before the mission. We weren't fighting to win that night, we were fighting to prove to them and to ourselves that humanity would no longer take the collar. Still, when he laid out the plan, I could feel the pulse in my veins quicken. The aliens had landed an outpost just outside the city, a metallic fortress that cut into the skyline like a blade. It wasn't large, nothing compared to their main fleet, but it was a foothold. From there they broadcast their threats, controlled surveillance drones, and monitored human activity across the region. It was also the perfect target. "They think we're afraid," Dorn growled, his scarred hand stabbing at the holographic map projected above the table. "They think we'll cower in the shadows, licking our wounds. Tonight we show them their mistake." The room was packed, fighters from every corner of New Chicago, some hardened veterans, others just desperate men with more rage than skill. Harris stood beside me, his jaw set like stone. I clutched my shotgun, the barrel freshly cleaned, and tried not to think about how many of us wouldn't come back. Dorn's plan was brutal in its simplicity: strike hard, strike fast, cause as much damage as possible, and scatter before reinforcements arrived. It wasn't about holding ground, it was about showing the aliens that their fortress could bleed. The hours before the mission stretched like an eternity. We prepped weapons, checked explosives, whispered last words to one another in the dark. Some prayed, others just drank. I kept quiet, my mind circling back to the broadcast, the images of children strangled and caged. That rage was my anchor. Fear didn't matter anymore. When the time came, we moved like shadows through the ruins of the old industrial district. The night was cold, the air sharp with the smell of rust and decay. Ahead the alien outpost loomed, its walls gleaming silver under the moonlight, towers bristling with strange weapons that hummed with unnatural energy. Dorn raised his hand. We froze. "Remember why we're here," he whispered, his voice carrying through the calms in our ears. "For the children, for our dead, for every laugh they spilled at our pain. Tonight we make them choke on it." And then, with a signal flare bursting into the sky, the first strike began. Explosions ripped through the perimeter as our teams detonated charges beneath the outer walls. The sound was deafening, the ground shaking beneath our boots. Alien alarms wailed, sharp and metallic, echoing across the city. We stormed forward, gunfire cracked through the night, the roar of human rifles mixing with the shrieks of alien weapons. Their soldiers poured out of The fortress, tall scaled beasts with armored hides and weapons that hissed. With blue fire, they were faster, stronger, trained for war, but we had something they didn't: rage. I charged alongside Harris, firing until my shotgun clicked empty, then swinging the butt of the weapon into an alien snarling face. Blood sprayed across my hands, hot and foul, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Around me, men fought like demons, unleashed, blades flashing, fists pounding, every strike fueled by the memory of the broadcast. The air was chaos. Explosions lit the night like firestorms, smoke choking the sky. I saw Dorn at the front wielding a stolen alien rifle, his scars illuminated by the blue glow as he cut down enemy after enemy. His roar carried above the battle, a sound that shook us all to fight harder. We pushed through the outer defenses, breaching the first gate, then the second. The fortress burned, its silver walls blackened with fire. Alien corpses littered the ground, their blood steaming on the cold concrete, but the cost was high. I stumbled over Harris's body, his throat torn open by a blast. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing, his hand still clutching the pistol he never dropped. For a second my chest cracked open, the weight of loss crushing me. Harris had been there from the beginning, the one who handed me my first weapon, the one who told me I was one of them. Now he was gone, and I couldn't even stop to mourn. I ripped the pistol from his grip, fired into the darkness, and kept moving. We reached the command tower. Dorn planted the explosives himself, his hands steady despite the storm around us. As the charges ticked down, he turned to us, his face streaked with blood and soot. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice steady, even as death loomed. "Remember that. Tonight we show them who we are." The tower erupted in flames, the blast tearing through the fortress. The shock wave knocked me off my feet, my ears ringing, vision blurred. When I staggered up, the command tower was gone, reduced to a heap of smoking rubble. Alien shrieks filled the air, their forces scattering in disarray. We had done it, we had struck them, but victory was fleeting. Overhead, the night split open as alien reinforcements descended from orbit. Their ships roared like thunder, beams of searing energy cutting through the city. Buildings collapsed, streets cracked open, human screams joined the chaos. Dorn shouted for us to retreat. We scattered into the ruins, dragging our wounded, abandoning the dead. The city burned behind us, fortress a shattered husk, but the sky was alive with alien fury. By the time we regrouped in the warehouse, we were broken, bleeding, fewer than half of us left. Harris was gone, so were dozens of others, but Dorn stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with the same fire as before. "They thought we wouldn't fight," he said, his voice raw but unshaken. "They thought we would kneel. Tonight we proved them wrong. We made them bleed, and tomorrow we'll make them burn." The men roared, fists pounding, weapons raised. The warehouse shook with their voices, and I stood among them, Harris's pistol still warm in my hand, my heart heavy with grief but blazing with rage. The first strike had cost us dearly, but it had given us something priceless: proof that the aliens could be hurt, that their fortresses could fall, that humanity wasn't powerless. For the first time since the broadcast, I felt it deep in my bones. We weren't victims anymore. We were soldiers, and this was only the beginning of our war. The warehouse stank of blood and smoke. We had dragged the wounded in after the first strike, their cries filling the night as crude. Bandages tried and failed to hold back. Death bodies lay in the corner beneath. Torn sheets, the smell of iron thick in the air. I sat against the cold wall, Harris's pistol heavy in my lap. Blood still dried across my knuckles. We had struck them, yes, we had burned their outpost to ash, reduced their command tower to rubble, but the cost was carved into every face in that room. Too many had died, too many were broken. And outside, the city was on fire, alien ships tearing through streets we had once called home. Dorn stood at the center, a towering figure lit by the dim glow of a lantern. His voice was hoarse but unshaken. We lost men tonight, good men, brothers. But don't you dare call this defeat. He raised a fist, scarred and bloodied. This is victory. They thought we would kneel, instead we made them bleed. They thought we were animals, instead we tore down their fortress, and they will never forget it. The men roared, some through tears, some through clenched teeth. The rage was still there, burning unbroken, and I felt it too, even through the grief, even through the exhaustion. I could feel it growing, spreading like fire in dry grass. It wasn't just us anymore. The strike had been broadcast across the underground networks, footage of burning alien towers sent from hacked satellites to every corner of Earth. People had seen it. They had seen that the invincible monsters could fall, and that sight was worth more than all the blood spilled. That night, in the days that followed, the world erupted, from New Chicago to the deserts of Africa, from the ice fields of Siberia to the drowning coasts of the Pacific. Humanity rose. Governments tried to hold back the tide, tried to control the chaos with drones and soldiers, but it was no use. Ray doesn't obey orders. It doesn't need. For politicians, factories once owned by corporations were seized and turned into armories. Shipyards were taken over by dock workers who welded weapons onto half-finished freighters. Farmers armed themselves with hunting rifles, miners with explosives, hackers with stolen codes. Everywhere the same chant rose: no forgiveness, no surrender. I fought in the streets almost every night. Skirmishes with alien patrols, ambushes against their drones, raids on supply lines. Each battle was chaos, brutal and bloody. We were outgunned, outmatched but not outwilled. Every kill fueled the fire. Every corpse was another reason to keep going. I'll never forget one night in particular. We were ambushing an alien convoy on the highway outside the ruins of old Detroit. Road was cracked, littered with rusting cars, the air heavy with the smell of oil and ash. Dorn led the charge, his scarred face lit by the burning wrecks. We set as barricades when the convoy appeared, sleek silver transports, guarded by towering alien beasts. We struck with everything we had. Explosives turned the road into fire. Rifles cut through their armored hides. Blades slashed at throats when ammunition ran dry. I found myself face to face with one of them, its scaled hide gleaming in the firelight, its maw twisted in a snarl. It swung a blade the size of my arm, and I barely dodged the steel screaming past my face. I fired Harris's pistol point blank into its chest again and again until the beast collapsed at my feet, blood spilling across the cracked concrete. When it was over, the convoy was ours. Weapons, supplies, technology, all taken, and the bodies of the aliens lay scattered across the highway like broken statues. That night, as we loaded the stolen supplies into our trucks, Dorn looked at me, his eyes burning. "You see it now," he said. "We can bleed them. We can starve them. We can break them. This is no longer survival, boy. This is war." And he was right. The war spread like wildfire. Resistance cells connected across the globe, sharing weapons, strategies, and fury. Men who had never spoken the same language fought side by side. Soldiers abandoned their governments to join the cause. Even some of the wealthy who had once lived fat on alien trade now poured their fortunes into building weapons, desperate to wash their hands of guilt. The aliens struck back. Of course, they descended from orbit in fleets, their weapons leveling entire cities, turning millions into ash. They wanted to crush us through fear, to remind us that we were nothing but insects beneath their boots. But every time they burned a city, the fire only spread further. Every death made us stronger. Every massacre sharpened our hatred. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't comprehend how a species so divided, so fractured, could turn its pain into unity. But we did. I remember sitting in a ruined church after one battle, my body bruised and bloodied, watching Dorn address a crowd of fighters. His voice carried like thunder through the shattered walls. "They killed our children. They laughed at our suffering. They called us weak, broken, unworthy. And now they see the truth. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not forgive. Humanity rages, and rage will burn the stars." The roar that followed shook the rubble itself. From that moment on, I knew this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was bigger than that. This was about proving to the galaxy that humanity would never again be chained, never again be mocked, never again be prey. We had become the storm, and soon the galaxy would feel it. The sky above knew Chicago was no longer blue. It hadn't been for months. Smoke from burning cities and debris from alien strikes choked the horizon until it looked like the world itself was bleeding. But in that choking smoke, something new was born. We called it the Forge. It was no government project, no clean laboratory run by polished scientists in white coats. It was a graveyard of ships, both human and alien, dragged into the dry basin of Lake Michigan. Every wreck, every fragment of technology, every scrap of steel was hauled into the basin by men who had nothing left to lose. Welders, mechanics, miners, hackers. Ordinary men turned engineers of war. When I first walked into the Forge, the sight stole my breath. Towers of twisted metal rose from the dirt, sparks from welding torches raining down like stars. Engines the size of houses gutted and rebuilt by hands blistered and bleeding. The sound was deafening. Hammers, drills, the roar of flames. It wasn't a factory. It was a beating heart pumping rage into steel. Dorn led me through the chaos, his scarred hand gesturing toward the hulks of half-built ships. "This is where the war changes," he said, his voice a low growl. "They rule the skies. They think that makes them gods, but gods can bleed, and soon they'll bleed in orbit." I stared at the ships rising from the ground. They weren't sleek, not like the alien vessels. They were ugly, jagged things, human steel grafted with stolen alien tech, patched with rust and fire. But they looked alive, like predators clawing their way into the stars. The men working there didn't care about perfection. They cared about vengeance. And every bolt they tightened, every plate they welded, every engine they Fueled was another scream of defiance, hurled into the void we didn't have. Scientists who understood the alien tech in full, but rage is a teacher sharper than any book. Men took risks, blew themselves apart in accidents, burned their lungs in fumes because they didn't care. Death in the forge was still better than living on your knees. I joined them when I wasn't fighting in the streets, my hands blistered from welding, my arms ached from hauling steel, my ears rang from the endless hammering. But when I looked at the half-built hull of a warship rising out of the dirt, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the broadcast, hope. The first ship we finished wasn't beautiful, it was a beast. We called it Wrath. It was built from the gutted skeleton of a corporate freighter, its belly reinforced with stolen alien plating, its engines stitched together with scavenged parts, weapons jutted from its hull like jagged teeth, rail guns stolen from military bases, missile pods welded from mining drills, alien plasma cannons barely understood but bolted into place anyway. When the day came to launch it, the entire forge gathered. Thousands of men stood in the basin, sweat and soot streaking their faces, their eyes blazing with anticipation. Dorn stood at the front, his hand resting on the scarred steel hull. "This is more than a ship," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is every scream they mocked, every tear they laughed at, every child they murdered. This is our answer." The engines roared to life, fire tearing through the basin as Wrath rose into the air. The ground shook, sparks rained down, and the men roared with it, their voices, thunder rising to meet the sky. For the first time in human history, a warship born from rage rose into the heavens. I was on that ship when it left the ground. My hands shook as I strapped into the gunner's seat, Harris's pistol still holstered at my side. The crew around me, dock workers, miners, outlaws, looked just as terrified as I felt. None of us were trained for this, but rage doesn't need training. When Wrath broke through the clouds, the stars spread out before us like cold fire, and waiting in orbit as if mocking us was an alien patrol ship, sleek silver, bristling with weapons. Dorn's voice came through the comms. "Calm, steady, this is it, boys, make them remember." The alien ship turned, its cannons glowing with blue light. "We didn't wait. Fire!" Dorn roared. The rail guns thundered, shaking the ship as slugs of steel tore through the void. Plasma bolts streaked across the darkness, smashing into the alien hull. Sparks and fire burst into space. The alien ship retaliated, beams of searing light slamming into our patched armor, rattling the entire hull. Men screamed as sparks showered the control deck, but we held steady. I squeezed the trigger, Harris's pistol long forgot, my hands gripping the plasma cannon controls. Bolts of green fire tore through the void, smashing into the alien ship's wing. The silver metal cracked, shattered, and erupted into flame. Crew roared. The sound filled my chest like thunder. For the first time, an alien ship bled under human fire. But victory wasn't clean. The alien ship fought like a cornered beast, ripping through Wrath's armor, tearing chunks from the hull. Men were sucked screaming into the void. Fires erupted in the lower decks. We were seconds from breaking apart when Dorn gave the order, "Ram it." The pilot didn't hesitate. With engines screaming, Wrath charged forward, colliding head-on with the alien ship. The impact shook the stars, metal shrieked, fire erupted, and the alien vessel split apart in a burst of light and flame. When the fire cleared, the alien ship was gone, torn into debris scattering across orbit. Wrath floated, crippled its hull, burning its engines dead. But we were alive. We had killed one of them. We had proved we could fight in their domain. When we limped back to Earth, the forge erupted in cheers. Men wept openly, fists raised to the sky. For the first time, humanity had drawn blood in space, and the galaxy was watching. The aliens tried to hide it, tried to cover up their loss, but word spread. Our networks broadcast footage of the battle. Across the stars, billions of humans watched as Wrath rammed the alien vessel into fire, and something inside them changed. The fear was gone. The rage was alive. In the weeks that followed, more ships rose from the forge. Vengeance, fury, revenant, each uglier, each deadlier, each fueled by the same fire. They weren't fleets yet, not compared to the armadas the aliens commanded, but they were more than anyone had believed possible. And as the ships rose, so too did the call. No forgiveness, no surrender. It echoed in every city, every battlefield, every forge. Men painted it on their armor, carved it into their rifles, burned it into the hulls of their ships. The broadcast had awoken our rage. Now that rage had wings, and the stars would soon learn what humanity truly was. The first time our fleet moved as one, the stars seemed to hold their breath. We didn't call it a fleet then. It was a collection of monsters patched together, hulks of steel and fury, each one held together with sweat, welding seams, and pure defiance. The aliens had ships sleek as blades, bristling with technology centuries ahead of us. Ours were ugly, jagged scars hammered into metal, but they were ours. They were human. Wrath had survived its first battle, barely clinging to life, yet it became the symbol of what we were. Every new ship carried pieces of her wrecked hull welded into their plating, a reminder that our strength was born from scars. The forge had multiplied. What began in the basin of Lake Michigan spread to deserts, mountains, and seas. Across the world, hidden shipyards rose in craters under oceans. In the ruins of collapsed cities, every man, woman, and child worked with bleeding hands, dragging steel, hauling engines, wiring weapons. The galaxy thought we were too fractured to unite, but nothing unites like rage. Dorn stood at the head of it all. His voice wasn't polished like a politician's. It was scarred, broken, but it carried like thunder. He wasn't a leader because he wanted power. He was a leader because we would follow him into hell itself. The day of the first campaign, he gathered us aboard Vengeance, the largest of the ships yet built. The crew filled the hangar, weapons strapped to their chests, grease still staining their faces. Dorn's eyes scanned us, burning like coals. We aren't here to defend Earth, he said, his voice cut through the roar of engines and the hiss of plasma vents. We aren't here to cower behind walls and wait for them to strike again. Tonight, we take the fight to them. Tonight they will know what humanity's rage truly means. The men roared. My throat was raw from shouting, my fists shaking from the fire inside me. For the first time, we weren't waiting for the enemy. We were going hunting. The target was a supply convoy in orbit around Europa. The aliens thought their patrols were enough to guard it, thought we'd never dare strike so far from Earth. They hadn't learned yet. Our fleet tore into the black sky like wolves, Wrath limped at, the rear patched with steel still. Scarred from her first kill, Vengeance led the charge, flanked by Fury, Revenant, and half a dozen smaller ships. Named after what we had lost, Ashes, Widowmaker, Orphan's Cry, each name carried pain, each name carried fury. When we dropped out of the shadow of Europa, the alien convoy gleamed ahead of us, silver transports flanked by escort ships, weapons already bristling. As their sensors caught us, the silence before battle is always the worst. The hum of engines, the rasp of breath in helmets, the heartbeat hammering in your ears. I could feel Harris's pistol pressing against my ribs, the weight of his ghost with me. Then Dorn's voice cracked across the comms, "Make them bleed." The void exploded, rail guns thundered, slugs ripping through the black like spears of steel. Plasma fire lit the dark in streaks of green and blue. Missiles roared from launchers, welded to rusted hulls, tearing through alien shields in bursts of flame. Their escorts moved fast, too fast, weaving like silver serpents, their weapons carving through our armor. Widowmaker caught a beam across its midsection and split apart in fire, men screaming into silence as their bodies spilled into the void. I manned the cannons on Wrath, my hands blistered from the controls, my teeth bared like an animal. Every shot I fired, I imagined it was tearing through the throat of the alien who killed Harris, through the chest of the monster who laughed at our children. We were clumsy, we were raw, but we were relentless. Fury rammed an escort head-on, tearing its hull open in a storm of sparks. The alien ship exploded, taking Fury with it, the names of her crew etched forever into our fire. But the convoy was bleeding. Their transports tried to scatter, engines flaring, but Revenant cut them down with missile, their silver holes bursting apart like broken bones. In the chaos, Wrath tore into the flank of an escort, my cannons ripping through its shields until its body cracked open. I saw them. Then aliens writhing in zero gravity, their scaled hides splitting, their eyes wide with something they had never felt before. Fear. The convoy burned, one by one. Their ships shattered into debris, fire spilling across the black sky. We lost Widowmaker, Fury, and half the smaller craft. Hundreds of men were gone, but when the last alien ship broke apart in a storm of fire, the silence that followed wasn't despair, it was triumph. We had struck them beyond Earth. We had reached into their territory and carved their blood into the stars. When we returned, the cheers shook the forge itself. Men lifted their fists, their voices echoing into the night. The footage spread across every hidden channel, every smuggled network, every corner of Earth. Humanity had taken its rage beyond the planet, and the aliens knew it. They struck back harder than ever. Their fleets descended, burning cities into ash, turning oceans into boiling graves. But now the world didn't cower. Every strike only fueled the fire. Every massacre gave birth to 10 more men, willing to strap themselves into rusted hulls and hurl their bodies into space. We weren't just fighting for revenge anymore. We were fighting because we knew the truth. If we didn't burn them, they would erase us. The campaign spread. Raids on their convoys, ambushes, and asteroid belts, strikes on their outposts hidden in the moons of Saturn. Our ships were battered, scarred, bleeding steel, but we kept coming. I watched Dorn change in those months. He was still the same scarred Iron Man, but There was something heavier in his eyes. Every time we won, we also lost. Brothers, every victory was bought in blood. His voice carried us forward, but I saw the weight pressing on his shoulders. One night after a raid that left half our fleet limping home, I found him alone in the hangar of Vengeance, staring at the burned wreck of a gunship being patched together. "They're not used to this," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "They fought wars, yes, but never against men who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. They don't understand it." I asked him if that meant we could win. He turned to me then, his eyes hard, burning. "Winning isn't the point. The point is making sure they never forget us. Point is making them choke every time they laugh at humanity again." His words burned into me like fire. We weren't just a rebellion. We weren't just a war. We were a lesson written in blood, and the galaxy would learn it. The broadcast had awoken our rage. Now our rage was teaching them fear. The stars lied to us. From Earth they had always looked quiet, cold, eternal. But once our ships clawed their way into the void, once our rage drove us deeper, we learned the truth. The galaxy was not silent. It was a graveyard. We saw it first in the ruins around Titan. Our fleet, what remained of it, had stumbled across signals, weak and broken, buried in the static of Saturn's rings. At first we thought it was alien patrol chatter, but when our hackers tore through the code, what emerged wasn't commands. It was a scream, old, faint, but human. We followed the trail, our patched ships slipping through the shadow of Titan's cold light until we found them, wrecks drifting in orbit, so old they were fused with ice. Human ships, not ours, not from Earth, something older inside the shattered holes. We found bodies, bones wrapped in frozen suits, faces twisted in eternal silence and scratched into the steel walls with knives, with blood, with desperation. We found words. They came, they laughed, they burned us. It wasn't just us. We weren't the first. Dorn stood silent in that frozen wreck, his scarred hand running across the ancient carvings. His face was stone, but I could see it in his eyes, the fire burning hotter, the weight pressing heavier. "They've done this before," he whispered, "to others, to thousands, to millions, entire species wiped away, buried in the dark, and now it's our turn." The words settled like ash across us all. Rage wasn't enough anymore. This wasn't just revenge for children strangled on a broadcast. This was survival, and survival meant extermination. We learned more as the raids continued. Every convoy we struck, every outpost we seized, we stole data, logs, records, archives buried in alien code. Our hackers bled their eyes dry, translating, tearing through encryption with fury sharper than any blade. The truth was worse than we imagined. The aliens called themselves the Zur. They had ruled the stars for centuries, not as conquerors but as butchers. Worlds were cattle pens to them. Species were playthings. They recorded every slaughter, every humiliation, not to hide it but to show it, to laugh at it. Our broadcast, the one that broke humanity, wasn't unique. It was a tradition. They had streamed the suffering of a dozen other races before us. They had erased them one by one, and the galaxy had watched in silence. Now it was our turn on the stage, but we weren't like the others. We weren't dying quietly. That realization spread like fire through our ranks. Men who once fought for vengeance now fought for existence. Every battle was no longer just another raid, it was defiance. Against extinction, the Zur responded. With fury, their fleets multiplied, swarming Earth's orbit, burning our cities to ash. New Chicago was nothing but rubble. The forge itself had to scatter into hidden bases across the globe. Every day, men died in thousands. Every day, the Zur laughed at our resistance, but the laughter was weaker. Now, behind their arrogance, we saw it. The cracks, the hesitation, the fear. We showed them fear every time one of our rusted ships rammed theirs into fire. Every time our rail guns tore through their silver hides, every time another convoy burned in the dark, the war wasn't survival anymore. It was vengeance on behalf of every species that came before us. I remember the day we uncovered the archives on Ganymede. The battle had been brutal, revenant, torn apart, hundreds dead, but when we stormed the Zur outpost, our hackers found something buried deep in there. Systems, footage, thousands of broadcast species I had never seen. Creatures with wings, with fur, with scales, screaming in cages torn apart for sport. Children murdered while Zur audiences howled with laughter, civilizations erased like chalk on a board. We watched in silence, every man frozen, our fists shaking, our teeth grinding, and then Dorn spoke, his voice breaking. This is what they are, parasites, predators, but they made one mistake. He turned to us, his eyes burning with that fire that had carried us from the first strike. They broadcast their cruelty to the wrong species. That night we made a vow: humanity wouldn't just fight for itself, we would fight for the ghosts in those broadcasts, for the bones frozen in Titan's orbit, for every race erased by Zur laughter. We would be the end of them. Campaign shifted, no longer raids, no longer ambushes, extermination. We struck not only their convoys but their colonies, their breeding grounds, their communication hubs. Our ugly, scarred ships moved like shadows through the void, tearing their empire apart piece by piece. The cost was unbearable. Ashes destroyed above Europa, orphan cry split open near Mars, entire crews erased in seconds, but every loss was fuel, and slowly, impossibly, the Zur began to retreat, not far, not much, but enough to prove they could bleed, enough to show the galaxy their empire wasn't invincible. One night, after a brutal battle near Neptune's shadow, I sat with Dorn in the wreckage of Wrath's hangar. His body was scarred more than steel, his voice rougher than gravel. He stared out at the stars, the faint glow of Zur debris burning in the distance. "You see it now, don't you?" he said quietly. "What?" I asked, my hands still shaking from battle. "This isn't just war, this is legacy. Every species they mocked, every child they killed, every world they burned, they're watching now. Even if they're gone, and when we win, when we carve zero blood across the stars, it won't just be for us." He turned to me, his eyes blazing. "It'll be for all of them." For the first time since the broadcast, I felt something deeper than rage, something heavier: responsibility. We weren't just fighting for humanity. We were fighting to avenge the dead galaxy, and in that moment I knew the truth. The Zur would never stop until we were erased, and we would never stop until they were nothing but ash. This wasn't survival anymore. This was extermination. One of us would burn, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be humanity. The sky above Earth was fire. Xur fleets had come in numbers no one had thought possible, hundreds of ships, silver blades cutting through the void, their weapons burning oceans, their shadows swallowing continents entire. Cities vanished in storms of plasma. Planets shook beneath their fury. They meant to end us here, to erase humanity, as they had erased the others to make our final screams another broadcast. But we were ready. For months the Ford had poured steel into the sky, every scrap of wreckage, every shard of alien technology, every ounce of human will had been hammered into ships, ugly, scarred, jagged things built not with precision but with fury. And now they rose in the thousands. Not a fleet, a storm, every ship carried scars, every ship carried ghosts. Names alone told the story. Wrath, vengeance, fury, revenant, widow's howl, father's blade, children's cry, each one a curse, a promise, a wound turned into steel. I stood in the gunner's seat. Aboard Wrath, Harris's pistol still strapped to my chest, my hands shook, not with fear but with fire around me. The crew was silent, faces grim, eyes burning. We all knew what this was. The last battle, the end. Dorn's voice came over the comms, steady thunder rolling through the fleet. Brothers, sisters, look around you, look at the sky. They came to erase us. They came to laugh at us. They came to turn us into another broadcast. He paused, his voice low, sharp, but they made one mistake. The fleet held its breath. They forgot what rage is. They forgot what it means to push a man too far. They forgot what it means to take everything from us. Tonight we remind them. His roar shook the void. No forgiveness, no surrender. The fleet answered, voices raw, weapons primed. The chant spread through every ship, every throat, until it was thunder. Across the comms, no forgiveness, no surrender. Then the void exploded. The Xur came at us like wolves, their ships slicing through the black, weapons carving trails of fire. Our fleet answered with everything, rail guns thundered, plasma streak, missiles roared. The stars themselves seemed to tear apart under the storm. Wrath charged headlong into the fray, her hull rattling, her guns blazing. Alien shields cracked under our fire, silver holes bursting into shards. Their ships were sleek, fast, deadly, but we were relentless. Every shot was fueled by rage, every strike by vengeance. I fired until my hands bled, until my throat was raw from screaming. Harris's ghost was with me, my father's ghost, every child from the broadcast, every frozen corpse on Titan. They were all with me, screaming through my hands, through my gun, through the fire. Battle was chaos. Revenant tore through an enemy frigate, ramming it into fire, both ships shattering in a burst of light. Widow's howl split apart under Xur beams, her crew's last cries echoing through the comms before silence claimed them. But for every ship we lost, two of theirs burned. Hours passed, the void, a storm of fire. The Xur fought like gods, but we fought like devils. Every man aboard our fleet was already dead, and dead men fear nothing. Then their flagship appeared. It was massive, a city in the sky, silver spires bristling with weapons, its hull gleaming like a blade dipped in blood. From its center, a broadcast began, images of earth-burning cities, crumbling, children screaming. They wanted to humiliate us even as they killed us, but the broadcast didn't bring despair, it brought fire. Dorn's voice cut through the comms, ragged but fierce. That's their mistake. They think suffering breaks us, but suffering made us. That broadcast lit the fire, and tonight that fire burns. Their empire. The order came, all ships target the flagship. The fleet turned as one, ugly. Scarred ships howled into the void, their weapons blazing. The Zur flagship unleashed hell, beams tearing through our ranks, explosions splitting the dark. Ships burned, crews died screaming, the void filled with fire and ash, but we didn't stop. Wrath led the charge, her scarred hull rattling, her guns blazing. I poured everything into the cannons, screaming Harris's name, screaming my father's, screaming humanity's rage into the void. The flagship's shields cracked, its hull burned, but it didn't fall. Its weapons carved through, father's blade split, children's cry in half, burned ashes too. Dust. Dorn's voice came again, hoarse, broken. Then we ram it. The order spread like fire. Ship after ship hurled itself into the flagship, engines screaming, hulls shattering, explosions tearing chunks from its silver body. Men died willingly, their deaths carving fire into the Zur's heart. Wrath was crippled, her engines failing, her guns silent. Dorn's voice carried through the wreck, steady even as death loomed. This is it, brothers, one last strike, one last scream, make them remember. The pilot turned us toward the flagship's heart. The engines roared, fire spilling through the ship, the hull tearing apart. I strapped in Harris's pistol in my hand, my eyes burning with tears and fury. The flagship loomed ahead, silver and burning. We hit the collision, tore the void apart. Wrath shattered, her body splitting into fire and steel ripping through the flagship's core. Explosions erupted one after another until the Zur's great vessel split apart, fire spilling across the stars. The fleet roared, the comms thundered. The flagship was gone. The Zur faltered, their fleets broke, and for the first time in their empire's history they retreated. Earth was burning, our fleet shattered, our dead uncountable, but we had done it. We had broken them. The broadcast that was meant to humiliate us had become our weapon. The galaxy had seen us rise from cages, from chains, from ashes and spit. In the face of gods, no forgiveness, no surrender. That was humanity's answer. And as I drifted in the wreckage, the stars burning with the fire of a fallen empire, I knew the truth. We weren't just survivors, we were vengeance, and the galaxy would never forget the day humanity's rage awoke.